Welcome back. Today we're going to take a short look at a genre we haven't focused on much up until now, poetry. But no matter what the genre, fiction, drama, poetry, the things we've discussed so far apply to all literature. So a quick review. What characterizes 19th century American literature up to this point?
Sex and drugs and rock and roll, yeah.
Yes, those are very good indeed, but that's not the right answer.
At first, they just copied European ideas and forms and placed them in North America.
Bingo! This was true for the era of the New Republic, for about the first third of the century.
And then they found their own themes and their own voice.
Exactly. In the so-called American Renaissance, American literature begins to find itself and go its own way, and this is true in poetry as well. The three big writers of the New Republic were Washington Irving for short fiction, James Fenimore Cooper for novels, and William Cullen Bryant for poetry. Bryant's most famous poem, Thanatopsis, deals with death, a very traditional theme, and uses prevailing European rhyme structure.
Uses what?
Don't worry, you're not expected to know all that stuff. Another example of a New Republic poet is Henry Longfellow. One of his most famous poems is The Song of Hiawatha, which deals with an Indian living on the Great Lakes. Again, it goes back to the pre-revolutionary era and creates a myth about a heroic Indian. The poem, however, sounds a lot like the Finnish national epic poem Kalevala, because Longfellow borrowed the rhyme structure from it.
So, basically, he was just sampling Scandinavian stuff.
In a sense, yeah, you're right. That's one way to look at it. Another famous poem by Longfellow is Paul Revere's Ride, a poem which generations of American school kids had to memorize. It deals with a real event from the American Revolution, when the British marched from Boston to Lexington in order to seize weapons. It was in fact this event which triggered the revolt of the colonies, not the Boston Tea Party 2 years earlier. Paul Revere was one of the people who alerted the colonials that the Crown was coming to take away their guns. All in all, very patriotic stuff, which often is the purpose of literature and history classes in school, especially for young nations. But the poem has fallen out of fashion in recent years. The rhyme itself is quite catchy, though nothing truly revolutionary. And this was recognized by Emerson, the one who sounded the Cultural Declaration of Independence in 1837. America did not yet have its own poetic voice. In an 1844 essay entitled The Poet, Emerson wrote this about poetry in America. It's a call to find a new voice and to use the nation itself as a topic. He himself tried his hand at poetry, but it never quite worked out. In 1855, however, Walt Whitman stepped forward and with the publication of Leaves of Grass accomplished what Emerson had predicted. His pioneering use of free verse and exuberant style, like the new nation, was a language that would not wait long for meters. Emerson loved this new style and congratulated Whitman on his accomplishment, although not everyone uniformly approved of his poetry. For some it was too radical, both in style and content. Nonetheless, the 1855 version of Leaves of Grass was the first of 9 editions Whitman published in his lifetime. The collection of poems grew each time, from 12 poems in the first edition to around 400 in the final deathbed edition in 1892. Whitman was 36 when he published his collection of poetry, and had already been a printer, editor, carpenter, and a school teacher beforehand, and had traveled throughout the U.S. Later, during the Civil War, he worked in Washington, D.C., both for the government and as a nurse, helping wounded soldiers. He was fascinated by Lincoln, and wrote poems honoring him after his assassination. At one point, though, he lost his government job, probably because his boss actually read some of his poetry.
His boss didn't like free verse?
It was more the content he objected to. The imagery Whitman uses can get a bit graphic. Writing about sex was not common at that time, especially if it involved 2 men.
You see, I told you it was about sex.
Whitman didn't just write about sex, though his poetry does contain a vitality and physicality which encompasses many aspects of the human body. But he is also known as a poet of democracy, and he emphasizes individuality and equality in many of his poems, listing professions, body parts, and people to show their basic equality. Andy is the poet of America, writing frequently about the country itself. His poetry often reflects the optimism of the 19th century. In other words, the Good Gray poet, as he was frequently known, literally fulfilled Emerson's prophecy of the country needing a new style of poetry to express what the nation itself represented. For all these reasons, Whitman is known as the father of American poetry, and the father of free verse. Because he opened up the language and topics of poetry, many 20th century poets felt the need to react to him. But not everyone liked free verse. One famous American poet later claimed that writing in free verse was like playing tennis with the net down. But we'll talk in the seminars about his poetry in more depth, and you can decide for yourself whether you like it or not.
Yeah, fair enough.
In the meantime, if there was a father of American poetry, you could also say there was a mother of American poetry as well, and her name is Emily Dickinson. Whitman and Dickinson lived at roughly the same time. She was born some 10 years after Whitman and died earlier, but it is hard to imagine two more different personalities. If Whitman was well known and a self-promoter, Dickinson was a reclusive individual who published few works in her lifetime. Whitman wrote about matters of national and social concern, while Dickinson wrote intensely private poems. Often it is impossible to tell when she wrote them. There are no references in them to the contemporary world. Dickinson was born in Amherst, Massachusetts, into a well-to-do family. Her father served briefly in the U.S. Congress. She herself left Amherst for 1 year to attend a college at age 18. After that, though, she rarely left town. In fact, after a few years, she rarely left the house, and toward the end of her life rarely left her bedroom. She was known in Amherst as an eccentric, and also as the woman in white, for her penchant for wearing only white. She published 6 poems during her lifetime, but her family was surprised to discover almost 1,800 poems in her desk after her death. Almost no one knew she had been writing that much. Nor does anyone know exactly when she wrote them. Based largely on handwriting analysis, most were written shortly before and during the Civil War, although no mention is made of the war itself. The handwriting also allowed editors to make a guess as to the order in which these poems were written. When all the poems were finally published in 1955, numbers were given to the poems as titles based on the assumed chronological order. Some of her main themes are death, religion, nature, and family, although a large number of her poems are personal and very cryptic. No one is sure exactly what some of them mean. Her poems are generally short and employ very compact language with unusual grammar structures and very powerful metaphors and images. This quote by Dickinson about the nature of poetry gives you an idea about what to expect. She wasn't just some eccentric little old lady feeding cats. She also had a sense of humor. For a little flavor of the poetry itself, take a look at one of her more famous poems.
She writes about her own death after she dies.
A blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz. And this ain't about drugs?
Well, synesthesia here can also represent death, but your point is taken. Anyway, as I said, this is just a sampling of her poetry. We can discuss more of it in the seminars, and you can air your views there. That's it for today. Next time we're going to go back to prose, and we'll talk a bit more about the post-Civil War era.